Thanks to the Gloucester Writers Center and also to Rocky Neck Cultural Center for having me here tonight. It's wonderful to be here to share my interest in bicycling. Those of you who are interested in bicycling or history or both. And I know that there's some in the audience who are interested in both. Today the news tells us much about the conflict between bicycles and cars, but that's old news too. Just hear this story from the Boston Journal of August 31st, 1897. Look at the headline, "Escaped Death, both in hospital and one may not recover." If you look into the story that was published that day, the newspaper said, one crash involved a 15-year-old West Medford boy, Sylvester Parham. He was returning home from Boston and crossing over the Mass Ave Bridge, trying to avoid the ruts and other obstacles. The wind was quite strong, and he tried to go to the right side of the electric trolley car to use it as a windshield. Just over the bridge, a big two-horse team blocked the road. As the newspaper reporter said, as usual, the driver not knowing or not caring for the rules to allow passing on the left. Parham made his own mistakes too. He slowed up, intending to cross over the track behind the trolley car and go up the left-hand side of the avenue to avoid the big wagon. He was struck by an inward-bound trolley car before he knew it. The Journal's article could have been written today with an automobile in the place of the big two-horse wagon. In the book, I described the many such battles cyclists waged over the use of roads, the railroads, and parks, and by whom, with whom, when, and how fast. But let's back up a bit to the beginnings. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, cyclists rode what were called bone shakers. Over on that side right there. Notice there's no chain on that bike. It's a direct drive off the front wheel. These were heavy, unwieldy, and unsuited for the roads, and rapidly fell out of popularity. In the late 1870s, they were replaced by high wheelers. Oops. These things right here, which were actually lighter than the old bone shakers. And you can see the high wheelers saying goodbye to the old bone shaker there, all the while chased by the dog down here. So a lot of themes that we're familiar with even today. That dog chasing happens every once in a while to cyclists out on the road. In the late 1870s, they were replaced pretty much completely by the high wheelers. But the high wheelers were expensive, about $100, which translates into $2,500 today, and out of reach of most Bostonians. So these riders were upper middle class professionals like the dentist, Walter Kendall, who commuted from his Quincy home to offices in Boston and Randolph, and leading businessmen like Albert Pope, a bicycle manufacturer and promoter of the first Wheel Around the Hub of 1879, a two-day tour from Boston to Sharon, and then over to Cohasset and back through Milton to Boston again. And here they are posing at Hyde Park. The story of this event was published in Scribner's Magazine and kick-started bicycling across the nation. Women got started too, and along with the less athletic men, traveled on tricycles. This group posing at Salem Common is the North Shore Ladies Tricycle Tour of 1885. On their way from Malden to Kettle Cove and Gloucester, returning then by bike, train, or overnight boat. In this group are women riding tricycles, some of the men riding tricycles as well, and others riding the high wheelers. In the group was Mary Sargent Hopkins, and you can see some of them actually. There they are posing along the shore on their way to Gloucester. And I would love to know exactly where that picture was taken. You may have some view of that, but there they all are.
I think it could be in Beverly, possibly.
Beverly, okay.
Yeah, on that stretch of road.
Yeah.
127.
Yeah, well, it's definitely along 127 because that's the route that they took, and there they are, stopped along the way. Yeah. And there's one of the cyclists, Abbott Bassett, with Dora, his wife, on a sociable tricycle, which is to say they were riding side by side, also on the North Shore Ladies Tricycle Tour of 1885. One of the people along for the ride was Mary Sargent Hopkins, a self-proclaimed expert on women's cycling and cycling clothing, a proponent of the long skirt for cycling, and later the publisher of Boston's Wheelwoman magazine. And there's the front cover of her magazine, a husband and wife, obviously, traveling on a tandem bicycle. Because of the expansion of cycling brought about when high wheels and tricycles were replaced by safety bicycles, similar to what we ride today, with chains, brakes, and pneumatic tires, many more cycling clubs formed and became full-service, all-season, athletic and social organizations. There were ethnically oriented clubs like the Riverside Cycle Club, whose African American membership came mainly from Cambridgeport and the West End of Boston, and the Boston Italian Wheelmen from the North End. There were also religiously defined groups like the Eagles Cycle Club of the Young Men's Catholic Association. There were also college clubs. There's the Wellesley College Cycle Club of 1893. A whole infrastructure grew up around cycling. Manufacturers abounded, such as this one, the Eastern Cycling Manufacturing Company of Amesbury. Newspaper coverage became so big that a group of newspaper reporters started a group called the Press Cycling Club. The clubs toured and raced and serenaded with special bicycle music. Massachusetts Bicycle Club March by Walter Dolbear. The music celebrated their clubs and cyclists' participation in the movement for good roads. That's a two-step march. They paraded in uniforms and distinctive club hats, along with floats, bands, mascots, and caricatures. Here's the Styles Band of Lynn readying to cycle in a Boston bicycle parade of 1896 that attracted thousands of participants and many more onlookers. Cycling clubs held parties, balls, cotillions, and minstrel shows, and competed with other clubs at baseball and bicycle polo. In the winter, they played whist and billiards, bowled and danced, and bicycle skated. The breadth of these social and athletic activities helps to understand the move to exclude certain of them, the, quote, colored clubs, from membership in the National League of American Wheelmen. And it provides a context for the struggle over women's rights, too. On July 4th, 1895, the Waltham Bicycle Park featured a lot of racing and also a bicycle costume contest. The verdict of the judges was expected to decide the question of preference between bloomers, knickerbockers, and skirts, long or short. The long skirt lost. The winner was a bloomer-wearing biracial young seamstress named Kitty Knox. The newspapers reported that some of the women in the grandstand showed their disapproval of the bloomer and knickerbocker costumes by roundly hissing their wearers. These were the traditionalist ladies, likely including a pioneering tricyclist, Mary Sargent Hopkins, publisher of the Wheelwoman. The following week, Boston cyclists left by steamship and train for the seaside resort of Asbury Park, New Jersey, to join thousands of other cyclists from around the country to socialize, politic, tour, and race at the largest yet annual meet of the League of American Wheelmen. Even on their cycling escape, the Bostonians could not avoid the era's social conflicts. Among the cyclists was Kitty Knox, the recent custom winner in Waltham. There she is. Thank you. Some of the Asbury Park officials protested against permitting Miss Knox to remain a member of the league because of a recently enacted league color bar. The Wheelwoman magazine objected to the notoriety of Kitty Knox's confrontation with the color bar, and also possibly because she wore bloomers rather than a skirt. And as you can clearly see here, she was riding a man's bike. And she danced at the league ball. But Kitty had her supporters. African-American State Representative Robert Timo of Boston's West End had convinced the Massachusetts state legislature to pass a resolution denouncing the league's color bar. Several prominent cyclists spoke for her, including George Perkins, a Cambridge politician, leading wheelman and sometime roads commissioner for Massachusetts. Abbott Bassett, the National League secretary and Boston-based editor of its bulletin, was in her corner too. Their support reflected the city's cultural heritage as the home of abolitionist spirit, still alive, although significantly weakened in the years since the Civil War. The Jersey Journal reported that Kitty has been well treated in most places. She is remarkably agile and expert rider. She toured with a party of wheelmen, and the Cycle Trade Journal reported that she had had her revenge, since she was appointed to set the pace and finished far ahead of her lighter-hued sisters. Today, when she appears in the street, she receives more attention than half a dozen racing men. But the newspapers also reported that she had been rejected at the Asbury Park hotels and restaurants, which prompted George Perkins to threaten a lawsuit against anyone who treated Kitty Knox so shabbily. Coming back to Boston, she was honored with the pace position in a long league run to Worcester to the Massachusetts Division's annual meet. And here she is, coasting down a long hill as pictured in the Worcester Daily Spy newspaper. And if you'll see, she's got her feet up on some bars there, which were called coasting bars, or coasters, which is a way to keep the legs free of the cranks and the pedals as they were spinning around. That was before we had kind of the freewheeling apparatus that we have today. Several other riders attracted attention in the cycling press. An article headlined, "Colored War in Boston," reported that Kitty was going to ride tandem to Newburyport and back with a young physician on a century ride with the Boston Wheelman Club. When she was turned down, he got very indignant and quit the run too. This led to a court case for discrimination. At several other century runs to Newburyport that fall, notably with the Century Road Club of America and the Press Cycling Club, she was apparently well accepted. The athletic star of the North Shore was, no doubt, Maggie Kirkwood of Malden. She was involved near the beginning of women's cycling, participating as a young girl in the Ladies North Shore Tricycling Tour and going on to tricycle centuries up the North Shore. She was an early woman adopter of the two-wheeler. Her first two-wheeling record of note was a 116-mile trip from Malden to Newburyport and back, and then to South Natick and back. On one century ride, sponsored by the Press Cycling Club in 1893, there were many reported crashes, and the following account of her pluck, quote, "While coasting the hill in Saugus, Miss Kirkwood was thrown, and her wheel was ridden over by 3 other riders. But she caught up again at Newburyport." A broad range of Bostonians joined the sport in the 1890s. There were 2 prominent women's clubs. There were African-American natives and migrants from the Tidewater region of Virginia. Yankees left poor rural communities in New Hampshire and Maine and rose through the cycling ranks. Still others were Irish and Canadian immigrants or their children. Chelsea's Winnisemmet Cycle Club had a Chinese-American president, Henry R. Foon. In October 1894, R. Foon joined the club's century race. The race started well, but the last 50 miles were done in a torrential rainstorm. The riders were soon covered with a thick coating of mud. Worse still, due to the abysmal road conditions, 7 men took to the sidewalk in Revere. But a policeman was waiting for them and deliberately toppled them from their bicycles and then took them to the station house in a pelting rain. Nationally famous local riders like the Butler brothers, Nat and Frank and Burns Pierce, all Protestant Irish-Canadian immigrants, Eddie McDuffie, an Irish-American, and the great African-American champ, Major Taylor, all raced in Boston. They were fierce competitors, but also teammates on the Boston Pursuit team, the very first integrated professional sports team in America. On July 21st, 1897, they defeated a Philadelphia team under the lights at the renowned Cambridge Cycle Park, just a few hundred feet from the Charles River. There were few cyclists among the most recent and poorest arrivals from southern Italy and Eastern Europe, but the North End's Boston Italian wheelman made a brief appearance. The Schmuckler brothers from Lithuania became Berkowitzes on arriving in America and founded a bicycle business, Hub Cycles, that lasted more than half a century. There they are in they're one of their first shops in the old West End. West Ender Annie Cohen Kachowski had 3 young children in rapid succession and left them all behind to set off on what was planned to be one of the great cycle-around-the-world adventures of all time. By the time she reached Chicago, she had ditched the long skirt and rode a man's much lighter bike. She also took the name Londonderry to advertise the Londonderry Lithium Water Company's bottled water, and carried that name until she returned. The bicycle became a new opportunity for romance, and the newly opened Norumbega Park in Auburndale along the Charles River became a prime destination. The park bicycle shed accommodated over 1,000 bicycles. The young people would rent canoes and go up into the many hidden coves to canoodle, as they termed it. The authorities clamped down and passed an ordinance saying that canoeing couples must sit upright at all times. There you go. The theme of romantic escape from Victorian virtue found its way into song, as in the tune Elopia. The sheet music cover shows the young couple escaping, we suspect from her parents, on a tandem tricycle with a horse and carriage in hot pursuit. As the craze died in 1900, some cyclists capitalized on the public's quest for speed in new fields, paced track races, motorcycles, and ultimately automobiles. Cycling entrepreneurs like local Malden boy Alvin Fuller went on to make it in the auto business. He went on to political fame, too, as governor of Massachusetts in the 1920s. The big story is this. Boston cyclists strove for greater space for bicycling and for social mobility. They achieved it, at least briefly. There were people who were interested in getting somewhere. Many were marginalized again when the bicycling world collapsed in the late 1890s and the social climate worsened, especially for African Americans. Kitty Knox's untimely death in 1900, the end of Mary Sargent Hopkins' Wheelwoman magazine, and Abbott Bassett's retreat to publish the League's bulletin single-handedly from his home in Newtonville all served to mark the end of Boston's cycling craze. Well, to avoid ending things on such a down note, I want to end instead with another aspect of bicycling, its poetry. One poet-cyclist, Joseph Dalton, published Lyra Bicyclica in 1880. In it, he rewrote famous poets to introduce bicycling themes, including a series called Sonnets by William Shakespeare. And he advertised a special racy edition for 10 cents more, available only at his Union Park South End home. The theme of escape from parental authority we saw in the musical piece Elopia was repeated as alternative verses to Longfellow's Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Nixon Waterman of the League's Bulletin retitled it Paul Revere Jr.'s Ride, and wrote of a daughter instructed by her tandem riding lover to signal with a lantern from her window. One if you stay, and two if we flee, and I in the lane below will be. They fled on a tandem to elope, chased by her father. At the time of the League's Silver Jubilee in 1905, with bicycling in decline, several last big events occurred in Boston. The old-time wheelmen gathered at Chestnut Hill Reservoir. At their banquet, Quincy Kilby, treasurer of the Boston Theater, now the Boston Opera House, and leading cyclist, penned this verse, and I'd like to close with it. 25 years of wheeling, pleasant and quickly passed. 25 years of pedal and puff, and the top of the hill at last. 25 years of health and strength, of frolic and fun galore. Our lungs breathe deep, our hearts beat strong, and we're ready for 25 more. And here they are reenacting the wheel around the club, wheel around the hub, and ready for 25 more. And finally, here the Massachusetts wheelmen posing in front of the Boston Public Library just after it opened in 1895. So this is a sampling of some of the stories in the book, Boston Cycling Craze, and I'll be happy to close now and answer any questions you've got. Thank you.